Oh hey, I didn't see you there. I was just watching these little guys. It's crazy to me how interconnected all of these organisms are, yet work so perfectly within their own little niches. You know, it's people like me who wonder about these same things and discover interesting tidbits about the world around us. Let's take a look into some intriguing research done by some of my colleagues.
We've all learned from young ages that bees and flowers are best friends. But it has been found that many bees can actually harm certain flowers in the endeavor to suck up the nectar. Bees can use their tongues to get nectar without attracting pollen, as well as pierce flowers to get to the nectar. Hummingbirds, however, have less tendency to do so. Flowers require pollination for survival, and just as any species, can and will adjust their structures to maximize survival. Seeing as how hummingbirds and bees are competitors, scientists were curious to see if there was a difference in the flowers preferred by these organisms, and with that, what causes this preference distinction. It was known that hummingbirds commonly feed on red flowers, and that bees are biologically less likely to detect the color red than hummingbirds. Using this knowledge, they asked specifically, do Trochelophyllus flowers actually manipulate their coloring in order to attract hummingbirds while repelling insects such as bees? And if so, what evidence can we draw on to support this? It was hypothesized that this is the case, because the former are better pollinators of Trochelophyllus flowers than the latter. The predictions based on this hypothesis were that variation would exist between reflective properties of hummingbird and bee-pollinated flowers, and that variation would exist between the behaviors towards different flowers in hummingbirds and bees. To test the reflective properties of the different types of flowers, a spectrophotometer was used to determine the reflection wavelength in each flower in nanometers. Flowers, both white and red, were sorted into either bee-pollinated or hummingbird-pollinated categories. To test bee vision, a color hexagon was used to test each flower against a green background, just as a flower in nature would have greenery surrounding it. Finally, to test differences in bee and hummingbird behavior, feathers were made to look like these flowers and were manipulated by color, red or white, and UV properties, absorption or reflection. Each feather had the same amount and type of nectar in an elongated tube as a reward for choosing that specific option. Hummingbirds who had never before seen flowers were introduced to the feather setup, and their preferences and nectar consumption were recorded. The same process was repeated for the bees, the only difference being that the time in minutes for the trial to last varied between the two based on field observation. Essentially, bees generally take more time to get the job done, so they were given more time than the hummingbirds to allow fair parameters for each. Controlled variables included a consistent artificial flower diameter in millimeters and breeding separation from nature for both species. The variable being tested was the preference of color and reflection based on attempts to extract from flowers. Data was averaged and placed onto mean curves in order to be analyzed. Take a look at the left side of the screen. Graphs A and B depict the relative reflection of white and red flowers over wavelength ranges. Let's focus on graph A. This graph shows the white flowers. As you can see in the ultraviolet range of this graph, up to 400 nanometers, the lighter gray line is higher than the darker gray line. This represents the trend that white bee-pollinated flowers are less reflective than white hummingbird-pollinated flowers. In graph B, it is seen that the darker red line is higher than the lighter red line. Thus, the red bee-pollinated flowers in this experiment were more reflective than the red hummingbird-pollinated flowers. To the right of the screen is the color hexagon results. The dots within the central circle represent achromatic colors in bee eyesight, indicating that they are harder for bees to detect. Therefore, the white bee-pollinated flowers and red hummingbird-pollinated flowers had the best contrast for the bees, as this data shows. This graph depicts the relative choice frequency of hummingbirds and bees in this experiment. Hummingbirds showed no significant behavioral preferences, as shown on Part A of the graph provided. Whereas in Part B, the clear-cut winner of the preference for the bees were the red, UV-reflecting flowers at double the frequency of the next highest preference. White bee flowers were less reflective than white hummingbird flowers, whereas red bee flowers were more reflective than red hummingbird flowers. Therefore, the first prediction was correct in that the reflective properties of both kinds of flowers did in fact differ greatly. Additionally, bees were more attracted to properties of bee-pollinated flowers than they were to hummingbird-pollinated flowers, therefore partially supporting prediction number 2. Hummingbirds seem to have no preference, which is in contrast to the prediction that both would have preferences. These results were significant as it demonstrated that since the bees had preferences while the hummingbirds did not, there had to be a mechanism which was repelling the bees from partaking of the nectar instead of there just being innate preference for both organisms. These results suggest that the Trochelophyllus flowers put in places many defense mechanisms to repel bees that will harm them, especially color and reflection properties. This study also brought forth further evidence that bees rely more on preference than learning quickly, which is the exact opposite of the hummingbirds. By studying the color space of bee vision, it can also be inferred from this experiment that it takes a while for bees to find flowers that don't display explicit contrast like bee-pollinated flowers normally do, therefore supporting the idea that defense mechanisms are put in place in specific flowers against bees. These hypotheses were supported in that reflective properties based on wavelength turned out to be different and that bees reacted differently to different colors and UV radiation than did hummingbirds. This experiment could lead to the testing of a broader range of colors of flowers as well as other defense mechanisms of exclusion in plants and animals alike.
How long was that?